My family has been in possession of this house since the mid-19th century. I didn't get the privilege of growing up in it, as my dad joined the military when I was little, and we were moved around all the time. Now that I'm almost in my 30s, though, and the shame of the idea of moving back in with my parents has worn down thanks to the state of the housing market, I'll finally get to. It's such a beautiful house. All it was to me as a kid was my grandparents' place, where we usually went for Christmas, but it has a lot of details I never noticed or appreciated when I was little. The beautiful stained glass at the front of the house, the spiraling stairs that reach all the way up to the ceiling of the second floor, the ornately painted mural across the back wall. It's stunning, and when I arrived, I was so glad I'd finally get to be a part of the tradition. But in my first month living there, I started to hear the footsteps. I thought that they were just my parents the first few times I brought it up and was shot down, though reminded of their early bedtimes versus the late hours I would hear it, so I looked for other signs. Doors open or closed when they shouldn't be, lights going on and off, objects moving, misplaced or taken away entirely, despite my parents' insistence that they don't touch my things. A smell, sometimes the faint scent of tobacco, could be written off as remnants from my grandfather's smoking days, but it seemed to swell up on occasion with no explanation. I could have sworn that one time I even saw smoke trailing out from the wall, but there was nothing in the room beyond it. My cat, Duck, seemed unsettled, time typically used gazing dramatically out windows, despite how much he'd cry and howl if I took him outside, had turned ill-spent. He stopped and stared at the walls, tail swishing as if he just saw a mouse to fail to catch. I often caught him looking up at the ceiling with wide eyes. Occasionally, he would jump and run away out of nowhere, something he never did in my old apartment. He started hiding under beds all the time, like there was company over he didn't know. But most out of anything, I could feel the eyes. I knew I was being watched. Never for 1 second was there a doubt in my mind about that when I first registered it. The footsteps became more frequent, and only late at night I began getting out of bed and checking every inch of the house, but they would continue and I would still find nothing. I even went out and checked the roof. Nothing at all. Still, looking outside did lead me to notice something. From the exterior, the way the roof is shaped suggests there's an attic, 2 main floors, both with high ceilings, but in some places inside, it looks like there's space missing. I asked my parents about it, since both of my grandparents have now passed, and they told me there was no attic. So I spent some time checking for myself, and yes, there didn't seem to be any doors leading up there, though I can't remember my explorations of the house as a child. It should be safe to say there really isn't one, that the missing space is just in my imagination. The more and more time I spent in that house, the longer I put up with the oddities, the more I was convinced there was an attic, and something happened in it. Why else would this house come out so utterly haunted? All of the place's history was family kept, told through word of mouth, so I couldn't say for sure how reliable it was. I never knew my great-grandparents after all. They did die pretty young. Maybe they were hiding something tucked away in that goddamn attic for all these years. Still, I waited for the right time. My parents weren't going to believe me. They were skeptics. So I didn't act until they went on vacation and left me all alone in the house for the week. I didn't waste a second of my chance. They left early in the morning, and when they were gone, I went straight up to scour the second floor for the 100th time. This was different, though. I had a hammer. I crept up to the top of the stairs, reaching up and feeling around on the ceiling. Nothing was loose, but I did manage to get my fingers into a slight gap between some of the boards. Drawing them back, I brandished the claw of the hammer, sticking it in and trying to pull it loose. With considerable effort and a verbal thrashing from Duck, who sat watching me, I managed to pry it askew, where I could reach in and pull it out the rest of the way. It wasn't enough for my head to fit through, but I could already see the real ceiling from down there. There was an attic. An absolutely atrocious stench hit my nostrils when I stood on my toes to try and peek through. It was bad enough to make me physically gag, whirling around and coughing, the taste of the smell off my tongue. Tuck immediately ran away to no surprise, skittering loudly back down the stairs. I didn't want him up there with the ghost anyway. When I lifted my head again, pinching my nose and wondering what exactly had gotten that bad up there, I was hit with a second thing, the floorboard. For the remaining few seconds, I was conscious. I stumbled, gripping onto the railing tightly. The only thought I could form before the shock got to me was how that was far too forceful to have fallen on its own. Pain was surging through me when I opened my eyes again, both at my head and through my arms. I quickly discovered why. When I actually took in my surroundings, it was definitely the attic. That much I could tell for sure. The only light was a bulb dangling above. In the middle of the room, I was on a carpeted section, and looking over, I could see the misplaced board sitting across where I'd removed it, not yet fixed. That smell from before was unbearable as ever. The very air I sat in seeming to permeate with it like it was trying to infuse into my skin. It felt so stale, so cut off from the rest of the world. As for the pain, that could be answered by the tight knot of rope digging my wrists. In the corner opposite me was a pile of what looked like mostly trash, but I could see that some of it was new and strikingly familiar to some of the things I'd recently lost. I blinked down at it a few times, the questions starting to run up in my head, but all of them were easily answered with the fact that I must be a fucking moron. A door swung open, and I looked up as the idea so unbelievable it didn't even occur to me walked through it. An older man, all gray and balding, his skin hardly wrinkled, footsteps hauntingly familiar. He looked down at me, and his voice croaked horribly when he spoke. It was as if he hadn't used his vocal cords in years. "The last son." I stared at him. Disbelief and shock were the only things I could bring myself to feel, so there wasn't a modicum of fear in my voice when I responded, "Who are you?" He squinted, sunken-in eyes gazing straight through me. Then he just shakes his head, walking over to the knocked board and pushing it into place with his boot. My eyes glazed over him slowly, taking in the appearance of a man in horribly worn clothes. They didn't seem to fit him right, torn up with patterns and colors washed away by time. The smell grew worse again, so I looked away as he returned to me, squatting down right in my face and breathing warm, disgusting breath down my nose. "You're the last son. It all ends with you, doesn't it? There were never any other kids in this house." He spoke slowly, with a slight drawl to his pained voice. It's almost familiar, in such a way that I held my breath. Something about him was so sickeningly. "He didn't want a repeat of last time, did he?" His voice darkened for a moment, making me purse my lips. That fear was starting to kick in the longer I looked at him. The man backed up now, giving me space to breathe and remember how awful it smelled up here. "Your parents never noticed. I'll get them to before this body gives out on me, but you found your way up here, but it's fine." He stepped across the carpet, reaching over to a cabinet and rummaging around with one hand. "I'm not a picky man. You learn to be real happy with what you got in a place like this." I held my breath as I watched him. The contents of the cabinet clinged around. The man eventually pulling out a knife so rusty I could barely tell that's what it was. He walked back over to me, crouching down again and twirling it in his bony hand. "I've watched you people for a long time." His voice grew rough and dark again. "Your parents, Donovan and Martha, both only children as well. It's all dear old Alfred would allow in his house, now that I wasn't in the way." I inched back a little, at the very least, hoping to avoid the putrid breath on my skin for the time being, but he continued like he didn't notice or care. "Time got to him before I could. He never got to see revenge in my eyes on the face of his dear brother for walling me up here. But you will, George. Someone must know of come-uppance, and someone must take responsibility, all for what was done to me." My breath hitched. In some twisted way, I had been right, but not right enough, and it was going to kill me. He raised the rusted knife, those sunken eyes boring into me horribly. I could see them now, eyes just like my grandfather's. Maybe it was out of love for my family, the family that I knew, not this strange man in front of me, but I got a spike of adrenaline as he started to bring the knife down. I flung myself forward, slamming my head into his throat as hard as I could, crying out in pain as rust met my back at the same time. He made an awful sort of gasping, choking sound, falling back on his ass and giving me the time to scramble to my feet. It was a challenge when my hands were tied together, but I managed running past him and through that door. I was met with the skinniest hallways and staircases imaginable, and an absolute maze of them. I had to suck my breath in to try and squeeze my way down one, wondering how anyone could fit through these awkward crawl spaces, let alone someone with that man's height. I could hear him starting to recover up in the attic, though, so I pushed that thought out and hurried up. The walls on this side had tiny minuscule holes and gaps, ones I could peek through if I really stuck my face to them. The thought of his eyes on me sent a chill down my spine. I managed through the maze, and found myself beneath a small trapdoor. It was a bit rough to get open, especially when my back hurt so badly to raise my tied up arms, but I got it. Lifting it open, a rug keeping it hidden rolling aside as I found myself in the parlor. Dread sunk over me as I scrambled out, running to the kitchen to cut my bindings apart as best I could, trying not to consider the possibilities of what he'd been up to in our house too hard. Once my hands were free, I found Duck and got the hell out of there. The whole time I could hear that man in the attic and in the walls. My great uncle, I guess he is. It makes no difference to me. I just didn't want to be anywhere near him. I had to walk to the hospital, seeing as I was a lone man carrying a cat with a knife wound in his back. Now that I'm there though, and I've spoken to police and called my parents, it's all really sinking in. I'm a fucking idiot. That's the main realization. But moreover, I have zero idea what could have happened to trap him up there. A horribly cruel fate, and one he survived for the sole purpose of vengeance. One I may never know the truth to, if he finds his way out before the police can get to him. I have tetanus, unsurprisingly, but I also still have my cat and my living parents. I doubt they know more than I do, but at least he didn't kill them first. That's all I can hang on to right now. And hang on, I do. It's a lot better than remembering my forgotten family member was watching us through the walls of that home for decades, alone and abandoned. I think I'm glad to be an only child.